believe. The evidence is overwhelming.
Hello everybody, welcome to the channel. Welcome back to the channel if you've been here before. Again, massive thank you to people watching, commenting and subscribing. Really appreciate it. I've never said this before, but if you hit the like button, that'll help the channel as well. That's the first time I've ever said on this channel, I think. Anyway, this is a video that is a direct response to Brian from Bookish. If you haven't checked out the channel Bookish, it's a fantastic channel that covers really important subjects with literature and books in general. But he's just really articulate and just fantastic channel. And he did a really interesting one where he looked at history, and he was bouncing off someone else. He bounced off a booktuber called Mark Nash. And Mark Nash was looking at historical fiction, and he just came up with the question, is historical fiction art or science? And Brian from Bookish took that on board and wanted to ask if historical books, so factual history books, were art or science. And he comes up with some really good arguments on why he thinks it's art and not science. So check out his video. I'll link it below. So check the video out because it's a really good video. And he says some great points. But I think it's the first ever time that I've disagreed with him when I've watched something that he's done, because I think it's neither. It's not an art. It's not a science. It's something else. So studying history and reading history books, and history books being written and released to the public, is a very specific thing. It's not literature, and it's not scientific study. It's something else. He referred to the education system and where history is placed in the education system. So I'm going to do that myself, because history is a humanities subject. It's not a science subject. It's not a social science subject. It's not an art subject. It's not a creative subject. It's not seen as a creative subject. It's a humanities subject. Humanities, the group of humanities subjects would be history, geography, criminology, politics and government, philosophy. These are subjects that do require some research and evidence and textbooks. They do need evidence. So there's a scientific study in there, but they don't use the evidence to then make stuff up. So if you compare that to historical fiction, that is what historical fiction is. They do their research. They make sure it can be as faithful to the time as it can be, and then they'll make stuff up. That is a huge difference between historical fiction and history books. There has to be a difference. If there is no difference and writing history is art, then I don't really know why I'm reading history books. The reason why we study history, the reason why it's put in the curriculum in schools and colleges and universities, the reason why it has value, the reason why I read it and studied it, is because I wanted to know about the past. I didn't want to just hear some great stories. There's billions of stories out there that are great stories. That's not why you look into history. It's a very specific thing. There are some great stories out there because the past is full of interesting characters and full of interesting events, but they happened. They're not interesting events or interesting characters that somebody made up. They actually happened. So if you're looking into those stories from the past, you're looking into things that actually happened. And I think that there is a responsibility for anyone looking into history that wants to have this approach, and the people that give you that evidence, so the people writing the books and collating the evidence together and coming up with their conclusions, to have some responsibility in the truth. Because if it's not about the truth, then it might as well not even be historical fiction. It could be just fiction. So there has to be that element. There has to be that idea that you're doing it to garner some kind of sense of the truth about the past. I wish I could remember who said it, but there is a quote. I can't remember who said it. It was actually the subject of one of my first essays in my degree, which was "The Past is Another Country." Discuss. The past is another country. And it's a great quote, because clearly the past is very removed from us, and we only have the evidence we've got and our interpretation of that evidence, and when it's not going to be the full truth. And actually, not just because of that, because we can't speak to the people involved to know if the facts are true. But even if the facts were true, there's a fantastic story by Ted Chiang in Exhalation up there. I'm pretty sure it's in Exhalation. And it's just a fantastic story that goes deep into this question of how truthful is the past. And the message of story is, in the context of the story, the most truthful account was all based around the feelings around what had happened, and not the facts that were the events that took place. It was the feelings that the people experiencing that event were feeling that was the higher truth, if you like, the most important truth that you could get out of that lesson or out of that part of the past. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this as well. So in that sense, you can't know the past absolutely. No, you can't. And obviously with that, you've got the bias in historians, and there's been a shift. There's been several shifts in the way history is written for quite understandable reasons. Brian talks about how at the moment he sees a threat with the right wing trying to mould the teaching of history into being like this anti-liberal thing, which is interesting because when history started being a lot more honest about what the past was, and we were being honest about the British Empire, we were being honest about slavery, and we were putting her story into history. So we were talking about feminism, and schools were covering the witch trials and all sorts of different things that were part of women's history. When all that was happening, that was a change. That was a huge change in the way history was being looked at, and that was seen as a threat by the people that were more traditional and were very conservative in looking at the past, and they were very much sort of top-down, sort of militaristic history, or the powerful looking at kings and queens, all that sort of stuff. They didn't like the fact that there was all this feminism stuff happening, and there was all this sort of criticism of the British Empire, and there was, because this is obviously, if you go back to the 60s, there was such a thing in this country called Empire Day, where we used to celebrate the British Empire, and people had a bank holiday day off, and there was lots of events celebrating the fact that we had an empire in Britain. And that went when it wasn't necessarily the right thing to celebrate. And there's been, there are still lots of traditional sort of old-fashioned people that believe that should be back, and believe that they can't hark back to the golden ages of the British Empire, and they want national service back, and blah blah blah. There is still an element of that in the feeling of the country, but that was a really important change that happened, and then there was a rally against it because people were like, no, we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be putting all this extra stuff in history. We should just be looking at the wars that we fought, the way that the country expanded, and we should be looking at what the different kings and queens did to change the country, blah, 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 blah. So the fact that he said there's now this other threat, which is like the opposite threat, and there's this feeling that that's gone too far and we should come back to traditional values, blah, 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 is an interesting comment. But it is reinforcing the idea that history is biased. History is written by historians. It's not written by the people that were there. Even if it was written by the people that were there, there would be an argument that was biased, but it's clearly going to be much more biased if it's written by people trying to collate the evidence, put that against how they understand the past, how they understand how people work, and how they understand the way politics work, and put that all together into their own interpretation of it. So there are some areas of contention. So if we looked at the English Civil War. The English Civil War, this is deliberately written by Diane Perkins as a people's history. So this is a bottom-up look at the English Civil War. This is about how it affected the people. and not necessarily how different elements of Parliament and different elements of Charles I's people were trying to deal with the instigators and the uprisings and the unrest and those naughty levellers and all that sort of stuff. It's not about that. This is about how it affected the people, and this is a product of this new way of looking at history, that it's about how it affected the people. And I think that's a good thing, but I would want it to be accurate. If someone wrote this, if Diane Purkiss wrote this, and she knew bits of it, but she filled in the gaps with stuff that she just thought would make it more spicy or make it more interesting, then I'd get a skewed idea of what the English Civil War was, which is naff. That's not what I want. I want the English Civil War. I want that book to tell me what happened. And I am well happy, absolutely fine, with the fact it's going to be biased, because I understand that would be true for every history book I read. And if I understand where she's coming from, that will either sit with my worldview or it won't, and I can move on accordingly. So, but I still want it to be accurate. As far as the interpretation of why these things happen, that's different, but that's not the same as changing stuff. So, that sense, it is a science in the sense that there are scientific elements to the fact that you are looking at the evidence and coming up with a solution, not solution, but a conclusion from the evidence. That is a scientific thing. And it is also, you could argue it's creative, and there is an artistic element to drawing those things together and putting that onto paper, how these things develop and the process of these things happening and the characters involved. But you can't say it's one of those two things, because if it's not a serious study full of facts, then it's not history anymore. It's historical fiction, or it's just the evidence. You could argue that a book of just primary sources could be a scientific book, I guess. But certainly most historical books are drawn from the evidence and then they write about it afterwards. So, when I read this, which I read for Historathon this year, I read this because I wanted to know what kind of atheism was in the ancient world. How was this being defined, and how strong was it? Was it a big feature of the society then? How did this relate to what I knew of the ancient world? I didn't want Tim Whitmarsh to just make it up. I didn't want him to make half of it up or a bit of it up. I wanted him to give me his understanding of how that worked. And there are some elements of the book where he's surmising the way that unbelief and some of the heretical thoughts would collide with the myths of the time, because he does say all the way through, it's not like a modern religion in that sense, but he does that, and sometimes he has to kind of reach some understanding from what's been written, rather than it being blatantly obvious where the atheism sits. And I think that's brilliant, but again, it's because he's trying to get to the truth. He's not trying to just make it up. So I think that's really important. Similarly, can you imagine if this is a more critical look at the British Empire, so like a more modern look from Linda Colley, really good book, but it would be awful if it was completely made up and we didn't do those things, or we didn't have that attitude, or that wasn't the overriding impact of the British Empire, and it was literally damning the past in a way that shouldn't be done. So it has to be accurate in that sense, but that's why it's a blend of these two things. It's not science, it's not art, Recently there was that film about P.T. Barnum, The Greatest Show on Earth, and I haven't seen it, partly because I know they whitewashed the character and just make up the fact he's this lovely guy, and he wasn't. And if this book was full of lies, even about something that seems so inconsequential, certainly more so than what we just covered, as the history of circuses in Britain, and it was full of just lovely stories that didn't happen, what's the point in reading it? So, even the lighter ends of history, you still want that accuracy as much as you can, and I've got this out. Can you imagine if this was full of lies? The people's history of Native Americans, tragic encounters, and that the tragic elements of it were made up. That'd be terrible. That'd be awful. I want to read this because I want to know what actually happened. I want these people's testimonies of these parts of American history that are still being felt now. This is important. And if it's not at least mostly true, then it's not important anymore. This book isn't important, but the subject's important. And it's a travesty of how important that subject is. So, you can't say that it can have that flexibility like historical fiction have. If I was going to read a historical fiction book, which I am going to start doing soon, if I did do that, I'm not going to expect it to be as accurate as a history book, a proper book. When I studied the witch trials, it was fascinating what happened. It is really nuanced. There's all sorts of things that happen. It's much more complex than people think it is. But I still wanted to know the facts. I wanted to read the evidence of what happened, and that's really fascinating. I didn't need somebody else just making stuff up and filling the gaps in. There's enough. There are some periods of history where you don't know a lot, and you do have to fill in a lot more gaps than other parts of history. But there's still that attempt to find the truth, which, to be fair, Brian said that the way he interpreted it was that he thought it was an art because the artistic, creative side of it was trying to find the truth. So we might be saying the same thing, but in a different way. It could be semantics. But it is about the truth. It's got to be about truth. And I just don't think that's true of historical fiction. I don't think people are reading that expecting it to be absolutely accurate, or at least I wouldn't. But I do expect it from history books. I do think the people who write historical fiction... Philippa Gregory's presumably the biggest historical fiction novelist, is she? Certainly, I see her books everywhere. In this country, she's really successful, and I think she focuses on the Tudors. I think Philippa Gregory really does her research well. That seems to be what her reputation is built on. And again, if it wasn't there, people would be going, I'm not going to read this because this is full of nonsense. So I do think there's an element that there has to be some truth in it, even in historical fiction. But I think you still, there are people that are characters that are made up for advancing the story. And if it's set in the past and the social elements of the past are present, but the characters are completely made up, so it's like a much more of a bottom end history. So it could be that there's some, the main characters are peasants or something, and they weren't sort of recorded in history. Then it could be that the setup and the setting is really accurate, and the characters are archetypes that are accurate, but the specifics of the characterization is not accurate. That's fine, because again, you're working within a setting that you're trying to make accurate while you're creating something really fresh and new and different and false in that sense. So I don't think that makes it untrue, and it means that people can learn a lot more about history through soaking up that kind of setting really well. I love the Doomsday Book by Connie Willis, and there's a massive chunk of that. Most of the book is just that idea of what it was like during the time of the Black Death, and somebody experiencing the lack of, it's a time travel story, and she comes from the from the present day back into the past, and it's a story about her encountering all of this hardship, and I won't spoil the book, but it's about the Black Death and about the lack of medicine and blah blah blah. But again, it really sets up the 14th century really well, and you do get that sense of it in a science fiction book about time travel. So I think that accuracy needs to be there, but the reason why we read it is if we... Sorry, I'm distracted by a message that came up as I was doing this. If we understand that the best history books are the ones that have really taken the research and looked at it objectively and thought about what... And when I say objectively, I don't mean they've not come to any conclusion, because a lot of the historians that I like have got a left-wing bias, but that's because that's how they understand the world, and that's how they understand history, and that's how I understand the world. I think that the advance of the Industrial Revolution and the way that capitalism was set up has produced certain economic processes that's resulted in certain highs and lows economically that have caused all sorts of different problems worldwide over the last 150, 200 years. Absolutely. And, you know, equally the slave trade set up all sorts of problems that have sort of rippled through time. And the big world wars in the 20th century have had all sorts of other ripples. I think, you know, that just because you have a bias, it doesn't mean that it's just the way you connect those things together and how you understand and relate to and interpret what you know definitely happened. So, you know, there is a bias, and as long as you understand what that bias is, then you can enjoy history. I've got notes up there, didn't need them. I've said everything I was going to say. Please say below if you think that I'm somewhere around some kind of understanding of thinking of it as a different thing. It's a humanities subject and not a science and not an art. Or if you think me and Brian were saying the same thing. That'd be interesting. But thanks for watching, and keep reading history because it's really interesting. This is part of the Historathon videos I'm doing, so I was really keen to put this up as a co-host for the Historathon event. So I will link below all the other hosts of the event, and I'll talk a little bit in the description about what the event is. But thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Bye.